Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of In the Eyes of Truth. Today with us is Geoffrey Roberts. He's the Emeritus Professor of History at the University College of Cork and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Author of many books and articles on Soviet history. The latest one is Stalin's Library, a dictator, and his books, published in different languages, including Russian. Well, I'm going to need to find that. Is it sold in Russia or is it?
Yeah, well, it hasn't just been, it hasn't quite been published. It's being published in Russian next month
Oh,
by
okay.
AST is the publisher. Yeah, so yeah, you should be able to buy it next month or when or later. And anyway, look, if I'll be happy to present you with a copy
Oh,
next time I'm
thank you.
in Moscow. Fine.
Thank you. Well, that kills the whole myth of everything in Russia is under control and nothing from the West is allowed in when you have
Sure,
books
sure.
published. Um, Professor Roberts, the issues in a historical sense I'd like to discuss uh, is the relations that we've had for between Russia and the UK have, I think, been more negative than positive over the last 400 years. I mean, they really opened up under Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Feared. Um, not that terrible. Back in the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth. Um, and you would think that the UK and Russia would be ideal allies. Both are at the edges of Europe. Neither one wants a unified Europe because it never leads to anything good. One is a land power, the other is a sea power. So you would think there wouldn't be this major conflict, but we have what we have, especially the last 300 years of history or 200 years of history with the Great Game and so on. What can you say? What is your opinion on this?
I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure. I don't know, but I'm not sure it's true that relations have been bad rather than good in the last several hundred years. Yeah,
Mm.
more bad than good. For the first 300 years, okay, there were problems and issues came up, but basically, Anglo-Russian relations were actually quite good. Yeah, it's only when you get to the 19th century that you get to the period of where intermittently there are very bad periods in Anglo-Russian and later on Anglo-Soviet relations. But the other point to make here is that okay, we tend to focus on the times of conflict, yeah,
Hmm.
confrontation and tension, because they capture our attention. They're very dramatic. But actually, a lot of the time, in the last 200 odd years, relations have actually been quite good, normal. And even at sometimes, very, very good. I mean, Russia and Britain fought on the same side in two world wars. Yeah, um, uh, you know, during the Gorbachev period, very, very, very good relations going on into the 1990s. Yeah, so Anglo-Russian relations isn't just one history of conflict. Yeah,
Hmm.
okay, but it is also true there have been very intense periods of conflict, contradiction, and so on. And so how do you explain that? Well, there are lots of different explanations. I tend to favour a kind of rather simple explanation. Actually, is that relations when they were bad were bad, and they were bad for basically the same reason, and the reason was an invention, a myth, right? And the invention of myth was the myth of the Russian threat, right? That has been the generator of of conflicts in Anglo-Russian relations. It's the generator of conflicts today, of course. And I say it's a myth because it's just, it is a myth. It's an invention. It's actually not true. It's not to say Russia isn't a challenge to Britain and other countries. Not saying there aren't clashes of interests, all kinds of difficult stuff going on. But the idea that Russia is a fundamental existential threat to Britain and most other countries, it's just that. it's just a myth. It's actually not true. Now, I'm just talking about Britain here, maybe other Western countries. If you're talking about Russia's near neighbours, then of course there's a much more complex picture. That's what why we've had this history of Russophobia and of contradiction and tension in Anglo-Russian relations. It's because of the persistent prevalence, periodic kind of like eruption of this myth about a fundamental Russian threat to Britain and the British people.
It's very interesting because there's been a lot of archives that have been opened up recently, Russian state archives, not just from the Soviet era, but from the Tsarist Russia. One of the things that came out was while the British were playing the Great Game from the Russian side, I'm talking Alexander II, Alexander III, Nicholas II, um, there was no idea that there was even a Great Game going on because there was no interest in going into India or in Afghanistan or modern Pakistan. It's one-sided, I guess, game. Um,
And you know the same was true during the Soviet period, of course. Okay, you did have this ideological challenge. You had communism and the threat of subversion and revolution and stuff like that. But basically, there was no Soviet threat to the West in the way in which there was construed to be in terms of some kind of a military threat or some kind of expansionist kind of intention. Yeah, 19th century. Yeah, that's right. I mean, basically, in the 19th century, as far as I can see, Russia, for most of the time, wanted to be an ally and friend of Britain because Russian leaders saw that as serving Russian interests. They didn't see any need for contradiction. Yeah, okay, there were particular issues that came up. There were conflicts and there were negotiations, deals, and of course, yeah, there was actually a war in the middle of the
yeah.
19th century, the Crimean War. But basically, the pattern in the 19th century is that Russia wants to be the friend, wants to be part of the European community of state nations, wants to be a full member of the so-called European concert, the concert of great powers that kept peace, general peace in Europe for nearly 100 years. So, in terms of what creates the problem, I would put the main emphasis being on the British side. Yeah, it's a British, mainly a British created problem. But look, it's not only a British created problem. Russia itself does things, lots of things, all the time in the 19th century and in the 20th century, which provides a pretext for these threat perceptions or generates these threat perceptions. And these threat perceptions are not completely irrational, of course, because of course Russia is a great power. It has a lot of power. It has interests. Yeah, it pursues those interests. It can at times behave in a friendly way. So Russia bears a degree of responsibility for this this bad relationship, this difficult relationship, as well as Britain. I mean, okay, so obviously the period I know best is the Soviet period. So of course, at the end of the Second World War, okay, we have the anti-Hitler coalition during the war, very successful military and political coalition as well. The perspective is that after the war, this coalition is going to continue. There's going to be continuing collaboration between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The United Nations is one of the institutions that's created as a framework for that collaboration. That's the perspective in 1945. Doesn't happen. The relations break down. We get Cold War. Why does that happen? It's because both sides see the other side as being threatening in various ways, threatening to their vital interests, right? Now, and on the Soviet side, Stalin wants more than anything to avoid a bad breach with the West. He wants the Grand Alliance, the Soviet-Western Alliance, to continue, but at the same time, Stalin does things which actually does intensify, provoke Western threat perceptions. And I'm thinking above all, the expansion of communism into Eastern Europe. Now, from Stalin's point of view, that's a natural kind of historical political development. And it's to do with the politics of what's going on in Europe, not just a function of what the Soviet Union is doing, but that communist Soviet expansion into Eastern Central obviously appears very threatening from the Western perspective. So the threat what Russia does have a significant impact in shaping and molding these threat perceptions. Come to the present day, obviously there's very intense kind of like fears in relation to Russia at the present time, particularly in Europe and particularly in Britain. Yeah, okay, those fears are unfounded, founded on a myth. They're a kind of invention, if you like. But nevertheless, the basic fact is that in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and okay, from the Russian perspective, Putin's perspective, this was a defensive action. It was a limited kind of action, but obviously, from a Western perspective, it could be seen as threatening, right? But also that action, okay, it is generally seen as threatening, but of course, that action in itself also empowers those elements in the West, people in the West, groups, trends, currents in the West who want to have a confrontation with Russia, yeah? who are extreme kind of Russophobes. Yeah? So Russian accents can, can to a certain extent, create the confrontation with the West. Yeah? As I say, on balance, I would argue that it's on the Western side is the main fault, but Russia has its responsibilities as well. And I'm not sure that Russia and Russians always see that or accept that as being the case.
Now, back in 1948, when NATO was getting formed, from at least from the Russian side, the view, it was thought that Stalin asked to join NATO at that point, which I guess would have, if it happened in an alliance, well, a military type alliance or for security from, from Lisbon to, or they were saying Lisbon to Vladivostok, they may have avoided the entire Cold War. That definitely would have tampered down the need for the Soviet Union to go expand westward to buffer states. But that was turned down. At least that's how it's taught on this side of the
Yeah,
border.
that's the interesting point you make, because of course, okay, what happens after the Second World War? You get this formation of this Soviet communist bloc, yes, Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, very tightly knit group, very what's the word? With similar kind of state structures and so on, communist systems, right? But that wasn't an inevitable development. There was every prospect, or there was every prospect, every possibility. It could have been a much like looser bloc. It was a much more diverse kind of politics here. But what turned it into a very tightly controlled Soviet and communist bloc was, of course, the development of the Cold War. I mean, the possible alternative to the actual bloc is of course is shown to a certain extent by Finland. Yes, the Finnish example. Finland remained outside of the bloc. It remained outside of the bloc because it remained outside the bloc, but it was in the Soviet sphere because it had a mutual defense treaty with the Soviet Union. And the basic deal was that the Finns would protect the Soviet Union's northern flank. They would have a friendly relationship with the Soviet Union. They would guarantee Soviet security from their position, and in return for that, they would remain outside the bloc, and they would also be allowed to take their own course in terms of their domestic politics. Now, that alternative, which became known as Finlandization, could have applied to a number of other European countries in the and Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. I mean, Hungary, Bulgaria gets a bit more. I don't know Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania gets a bit more common, but that was a possibility, right? But that possibility was curtailed by the Cold War. Okay, you mentioned NATO. Yeah, okay. Obviously, the formation of NATO, 1949, was seen by the Soviets as a threat. And indeed, it was a threat because, of course, it was an anti-Soviet military political alliance. Yeah, for sure, it was a threat. And very quickly, that threat took a material form in terms of rearmament in the West, including the rearmament of Western Germany, yeah, and eventually Western Germany's admission into NATO. Now, of course, that was hugely threatening development from the Soviet point of view because they just fought a war with Germany, which 25 million people
Yeah.
had been killed. Of course, it's going to be. Of course, they're going to be concerned about that. But yeah, but in the early years of NATO, yes, in the early 1950s, on at least two occasions, including on one occasion by Stalin, so the Soviets suggested that, well, if NATO is a defensive Western alliance, like you say, then perhaps we can become a member of NATO. And then in 1954, the Soviet, this is after Stalin's death, the Soviet
Mhm.
Union actually proposed formally a formal proposal to to the West about opening talks about the possibility of Soviet membership of NATO, and that perspective was part of a more general outlook of the Soviet Union at that time, which was what the Soviets were arguing for in the 1950s was a comprehensive pan-European collective security organization or treaty or space,
Mhm.
right? Which would include the Soviet Union and all countries of Europe as well. And in that context, that Soviet membership of NATO could be part of the picture, as could the United States' participation in this system of European collective security. So that was the perspective, and the perspective was okay. The perspective was okay. It was aimed at trying to stop the Germans being rearmed. It was also aimed at trying to curtail the expansion and development of NATO, but it was also genuinely aimed at ending the Cold War and replacing the Cold War with a comprehensive European security system. Now we jump forward to the present time. In effect, the Russian position is essentially the same, except nowadays the Russians, Putin in particular, they talk more about Eurasian security, not just European security.
Mhm. Yeah, there's yeah, I interviewed Colonel Wilkerson a couple times, and we were discussing that because he was chief of staff for Colin Powell. When Colin Powell was a general, and Colin Powell was Secretary of State. And one of the things that he mentioned was when Yeltsin asked to join NATO, and this was under Bush Sr., they were actually looking into it and taking it seriously. But when Clinton came in with all the scandals, Clinton had to act the tough guy to alleviate some of his criticism. So they deep sixed that whole idea. And then, well, we have what we have in the 90s, and then, but Vladimir Vladimirovich also proposed to join NATO at one point. Uh, Quite a few years ago, true. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have gone too very, very far either.
That's all part of the picture of you know, essentially Russia wanting to be integrated into a wider European security space. Yeah. Okay, it wants to be integrated on its terms, on terms
Yeah.
of its respect and recognition of its position as a great power, a great power. But it has up until now, maybe not in the future. I'm not sure actually, been a genuine kind of aspiration. The problem was that always, when it came down to it, at the crucial moments, Russia wasn't seen as an ally. Russia wasn't seen as a partner. It was seen as a threat or a potential threat, and that directed other choices to be made. So in terms of from the American position, yeah, okay, the most convincing argument I've heard as to why the Americans spurned Russian suggestions that they should become part of NATO is that the Americans wanted a reason to stay in Europe, to remain in Europe, to remain engaged in Europe, right? And the way to remain engaged in Europe was actually to expand NATO in the Russian direction, but to exclude Russia itself from NATO. Okay, there were supposedly all kinds of other relationships were going to be developed with Russia, institutional relationships, but they in the end they didn't amount to much. So this was all about in a way NATO expansion wasn't about Russia; it was about the United States and the United States continuing involvement in in Europe, which of course was welcomed by a number of European countries. Yeah, for sure, that was the case. And in a way, again, we can jump to the present day. Well, okay, there's a lot of saber rattling going on in Europe, in European side, Britain in particular, about rearmament, about the threat of Russian attack. Some people even saying we're at war already with Russia in a certain context. All of that kind of stuff. Okay, what's that all about? One of the primary things that's all about, it's all about trying to keep the Americans in Europe. They want to keep the Americans actively engaged in Europe. That's the motivation.
As far as the British politicians, because I understand the Europeans and to a degree the British also, but as far as the British politicians, when they saber rattle, or actually I guess threatened, because I watched a BBC interview with one of the vice ministers of Minister of Defense. I can't remember his name. We said, we got to accept a war with Russia without actually declaring war with Russia, obviously, and we have to control the population. We need martial law. How much of it is because they're really afraid of Russia? How much is it to be able to control what's happening, the breakdown that's happening inside of British society right now?
Well, that's kind of a good question. I mean, George Kennan, who was who famously was the architect of the American strategy of
Hmm.
containment of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Also served as, he was in Russia and he served as an ambassador in the Soviet Union in the early 1950s, right? He said once, he says, and he was talking about Western propaganda in relation to the Soviet Union. And he said he didn't know what was the most frightening thing about this propaganda. The fact that the people who spoke it believed it, or the fact that they didn't believe it. Both were equally terrifying kind of prospects. And I think it's the same today, isn't it? I mean, what would be worse? What would be worse? The fact that they actually believe this propaganda, or the fact that they don't? It's just propaganda, it's just cynicism, it's just manipulation. Actually, my answer is I think, unfortunately, to a large extent, they do believe their own propaganda. I mean, at
That's
least
scary.
that's what. Well, and that's what I discovered as a historian. When I'm a
Yeah.
historian of the Cold War. When I go back to the Cold War, it's just amazing to what extent the Cold War propaganda reflected actual beliefs and attitudes and calculations on both sides, Soviet side and on the West side. So it is quite scary, given the extreme kind of nature of it. Given that
Oh
it's
yeah.
resulted in this, not just in an actual war, actually, a proxy war, a
Yeah.
very dangerous proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. And I
Yep.
mean, it's all this kind of, okay, a lot of it's talk, it's rhetoric. They're never going to be able to militarize European societies or British society in which the way they might aspire to. I just don't believe that's possible. But it's dangerous in terms of what might happen as a result. If they go too far, they miscalculate. Who knows how bad it could actually be. But my answer question, yeah, I think they do believe they're appropriate. Not, yeah, okay, maybe not to the extent that it's exaggerated. Of course, the
Hmm.
propaganda exaggerates their beliefs, and there are sensible elements among Western establishment. I mean, shouldn't get the idea that they're all warmongers, they're all Russophobes, they're all gung ho for a conflict with Russia. I think that's certainly true of a kind of hardcore, and of course that hardcore at the moment is very present in the public information space, isn't it? Right? They
Oh
dominate the
yeah,
kind of airwaves,
absolutely.
because they have a simple message, they have a sensationalist message, and of course the Western media, mainstream media, laps all this stuff. And the effect of that is it kind of like it squeezes out more pragmatic, more sensible elements
Yep.
in the
Yep.
establishment. I keep hoping, as the Ukraine war progresses, as the reality of it becomes clearer, as the direction of the war, what's obviously going to happen, right? Which is okay, some kind of Russian victory. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be a glorious victory or an untarnished victory, but some kind. As that becomes clear, surely they'll come to their senses and start saying some different things
Hmm.
and shifting their position. But so far, I haven't seen much evidence of that. But what I see evidence is more and more propaganda, more and more
Yeah.
extremist propaganda, and more and more extravagant kind of like statements. It's just all over the place.
Yeah, yeah, honestly, for me, it's more scary when they believe it. Because if they're using it as a tool and they have some grasp of what reality is, they know when to switch the tool off or when to step
Yeah,
back. But if they're true believers,
yeah,
when you're
yeah,
dealing with fanatics, true believers it's the scariest type of people because there's no off switch. They're
yeah.
just all forward.
I well, hopefully, sorry, hopefully you're wrong.
I hope
there,
I'm
there,
wrong.
there,
Yeah, very
there,
much I hope I'm wrong.
and there is an off switch. I suppose the other thing you say is that okay, uh, historically, we've had this intense bounce of anti-Russia stuff going on, yeah,
Hmm.
and pointing towards war and direct military conflict, all that kind of stuff, whatever that kind of stuff like that. But it has been switched off. It's proved to be, this Russophobia, this difficult relations is kind of like it's persistent but it's not constant, yeah, so it is
Hmm.
possible to kind of like switch it off. So in a way, this we could just call it Russophobia as a shorthand is is persistent, right, and it's and often pervasive in a way,
Hmm.
seeps into the wider society, but it's also quite superficial, yeah,
Hmm.
it's actually quite superficial. So quite sharp changes in position are possible. I mean, the last time we saw that, of course, was in the late 1980s. During
Right.
the Gorbachev the Gorbachev period. So yeah, so I think it is, yeah. Yeah, okay, and at some point, yeah, actually, I'll step back from that. Do you know one thing I think that's actually really does protect us from it not being switched off and it just following its logic through.
Hmm.
And that's the fact that Russia has, was it 7,000 nuclear weapons? Is that the
Oh yeah.
figure? I'm trying
Yeah.
to remember,
Yeah.
something like that. And the capacity to wipe out the whole world many, many, many times over. If it wasn't for that nuclear arsenal, or the existence of, I think there'd be a very, very good chance of some kind of repeat of what happened in relation to the First World War, so, or something like that, some kind of
Yep.
large scale, direct conventional war. I think I think that the nuclear factor in this kind of situation, when you have this kind of hysteria, yeah, and this extremism, is the ultimate kind of like block against them actually going too far down this road of confrontation with Russia.
You know, which is amazing to look at it because if you look at it, um, you've got a new bloc forming, which is basically the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, between Hungary, Slovakia, Czech now, and Austria that are against a lot of this. So they're forming their own entity and they all have historical ties together. But on the other hand, you have the Germans are screaming, we're going to be the main military power in Europe outside, I guess, Russia. Um, and the Poles are starting to get worried. You can tell some of the actions from Novorossiysk that the Poles are not feeling very comfortable with the Germans aiming to build up. But that doesn't play in a long-term strategy for the UK either. If the Germans are rearming and they're looking to become an actual serious military power.
Mm. I mean, you started off, we started the program. You said something like, how in a way, Britain and Russia are kind of natural allies
Mm,
because they're separated. They've got separate kinds of interests and so on.
right.
It's always struck me that the most natural allies in Europe, actually, the European countries, are Russia and
Yeah.
Germany. Actually, they're the most natural allies. Yeah, look, okay, but yes, a very important point is that the West, whatever that might mean, is not a unified bloc, in unified politically. Yeah, right.
Hmm.
You mentioned a number of countries which have semi-detached themselves from this anti-Russia position, but in every country in Europe, including in Britain, Germany, particularly in Germany, there's huge kind of opposition
Yep.
to this political course of confrontation with Russia. There's, okay, I was going to say huge support for a negotiated diplomatic settlement of the Ukraine war for peace. It's actually mostly quite passive, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah,
But in terms of
that's true.
public, very passive. But the public opinion basis there. So the Western warmongers, if we can call them so short, don't have the political basis in any way. They don't. They certainly don't have the military wherewithal, right? But they don't have the political basis for pursuing this course of confrontation with Russia. And I think that's the reality. They may not want to accept it, but eventually it's going to catch up with them, and presumably it will catch up with them in form of elections. Yeah, and new governments coming to power in different countries in Europe.
When the UK left through Brexit, there was a lot of there's Cameron, no, still Cameron. There was a lot of hope in Russia that there would be new economic ties between the UK needed new trade partners. There was a lot of hope that there would be a new development in economic ties. Fortunately, that didn't seem to materialize either, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, because what happened before Brexit was the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis, wasn't it?
Yeah.
2014, and the Maidan events, and Russian takeover in Crimea. And Britain very much hits itself to the sanctions against Russia, and in fact was very passive in relation to try to find any kind of settlement the Ukraine. The famous Minsk Minsk Accords. But the British, and probably like lots of politicians or states leaders, they always think they can have their cake and eat it. Yeah, they can have the benefits of a trade relationship with Russia or China at the moment,
Hmm.
but also continue along a course of political hostility. What do they think is going to happen? And I think the Russians are going to react to the demonization of their president, yeah, the
Hmm.
characterization of their society as being authoritarian and a dictatorship, and the characterization of its foreign policy as being threatening, yeah, threatening to not just to particular countries, but also threatening the whole world order, threatening global stability. How do I think Russia and Russians are actually going to respond to that kind of positioning?
Yeah, it's true. What amazes me, okay, Ukraine, and I have relatives up and down that area myself, and a lot of them have been under fire for 12 years from the Ukrainian army side, and some on the other side of the Prussian borders. But for Russians, Ukraine is a civil war because we're fighting Russians. But other than that, when the Europeans start screaming that Russia is going to invade, and the question on most Russians' mind is, why would we bother? What do you have that we need? Okay,
Yeah,
this is an internal family affair.
yeah,
Past that border, there's nothing
yeah, yeah,
that you have that we want or we need.
yeah. I mean,
Definitely not land.
that's the great tragedy, isn't it? Of the Ukraine war, right?
Yeah.
It is a civil war. It is, I mean, there's no closer people than Ukrainians and Russians, if you and Belarusians, if you include
Hmm.
no closer people, and yet hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians have been killed. Large
Millions.
parts of Ukraine have been
Yeah.
destroyed. It's going to take decades, generations to actually to rebuild those parts of Ukraine where the war has been fought, and that has happened. Okay, it's happened because yeah, Putin, Russia did invade, had its reasons, but it started towards no doubt about that. But and that in itself was a tragedy. Um, but yeah, a tragedy kind of magnified by Western decisions to fight a proxy war with Russia over
Hmm.
Ukraine. Okay, we have you to presumably let's be generous here. Yes, let's assume they genuinely did want to support Ukraine in the war against Russia, and that they were genuinely on the side of Ukraine, but also because they had other motives, their own motives
Of
about their
course.
own relationships with Russia as well, and also domestic political considerations playing into um, Western actions in relation to Ukraine and Russia. I mean, the Russiagate scandal and its aftermath,
Yeah.
huge kind of impact in
Deal
shaping
dossier.
American domestic politics and hence having an impact on American foreign policy. So this, if it wasn't for these external actors being involved in this war, okay, the war could have been over, within weeks, if not within months, if not weeks, right?
Months. Yeah.
Okay, and it would have been bad, but the damage would have been limited. Now it's going to take, I don't know how long it's going to take to actually repair, the damage between Russia and Ukraine and Russians and Ukrainian people. That to me is the real the real tragedy of this war.
Just to underline what you were saying, and the with Boris Johnson sabotage, the Russian army, and I know this from high-ranking officers, the Russian army for the first 3.5 or so months of this conflict was under orders not to shoot first, quite literally. I know guys that said, we're watching the Ukrainians getting ready for an assault. We can't shoot. We can't preemptively strike. We have to sit there and wait until they start engagement, and only then we can shoot. So they're fighting, but in a more defensive role because the negotiations are going on. So that was a very restrictive rules of engagement. They got loosened up as obviously after Boris Johnson's visit and Zelensky walking away from the negotiations. But that was this pseudo conflict. I guess you can't really call it a full-scale war. It still isn't a full-scale war for the most part, but
No, no, it's a pretty large scale war, but it's not full scale. Yeah,
yeah.
for sure. Yeah, it's a, yeah, yeah. Okay, but in relation to the failed Istanbul talks and the failed Istanbul peace, personally, I'd like to know more about what went on. Yeah, in
Hmm.
terms of documentary evidence, because I think it's very easy to point the finger at Boris Johnson and the Americans, the West in general. But I got a sneaking suspicion that walking away from those talks was at least as much Zelensky's idea as it was Boris Johnson's. I think the Ukrainians had some agency in this
Hmm.
situation. But one thing I'm certain about is that I'm certain, fairly sure, fairly confident, is that on the Russian side, on Putin's side, they wanted to make a deal
Yep.
if they could get a deal. And they wanted the war to end. Yeah, okay, they wanted on terms which would suit their goals, security, and so on. Yeah, and also obviously protect the Russian compatriots in Ukraine and so. But basically, they wanted peace. And the amazing thing is, of course, 3.5 years later, that's still the position. That's
Yeah.
still Putin's position. I mean, how many times has he said that the Minsk, the Istanbul talks and documentation is the starting point for negotiations to bring about a lasting peace in Ukraine? He said that to his blood. So the idea of a negotiated peace is still alive. It's being kept alive primarily on the Russian side. Obviously, since Trump has come to power, the Americans have played a more positive role in that regard. Recently, there's been a kind of backing away from
Mm.
getting involved in it, right? But it's the Russians who want to make peace if they can on the right terms, right? It's the West, it's
Professor,
the Europeans, it's Brennan.
I'm sorry I have
Go.
to interrupt. We've got like about 30 seconds left.
Okay, sorry.
So I want to thank you for joining, and I hope this isn't the last call. I hope this is the beginning of a longer
Yeah.
relationship in the discussion. And I want to thank everybody else who joined the call, watching this. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments. I'll make sure to get it over. Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Thanks. Yeah, yeah. I'm happy to answer any questions in your comments column as well if you want. Happy to do that.
Mhm.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.